Void Miner, Children of the Belt, Part 1. Prelude. The hub was restless, as always, even in the slow hours when the station lights dimmed to stimulate a cycle of night. It carried a thrum beneath its patched skin. Air pushed through vents, water recycled in hidden loops, and the voices of its people never fully faded. 1,000 small disputes, 1,000 fragile connections. None of it ever stopped. Arg walked the narrow corridor that led toward the guild's meeting chamber, boots heavy against the worn plating. He'd walked this way so often now it had its own rhythm, as if the metal itself had taken the beat of his steps into memory. The guild was young, barely held together, but somehow it had become real. Captains and crew chiefs who would have slit each other's throats in older days now sat together under a single banner, because there wasn't any other way to survive. Water rights, trade lanes, salvage claims, they all came through the guild now. Arguments flared often, but at least they flared in the open, in the chamber, instead of spilling blood in back corridors. Inside, the air smelled of too many bodies pressed too close, a mix of sweat and machine oil, layered over with the faint tang of recyc. Arg took his seat at the edge, letting Kara handle the front. That had become their rhythm, too. She stood with her hands braced lightly on the central table, not commanding, but steadying. Her voice carried calm authority, smooth, sharp words, and redirected tempers with precision. She didn't overpower. She guided, coaxing stubborn crews toward reluctant compromise. Arg watched her as much as he listened to the talks. It never ceased to strike him how different her way was from his. Where he would have pushed or forced, she deflected. Where he might have broken a dispute down to fists, she used words like tools. He couldn't say the room trusted her, not fully, not yet. But they relied on her, and that was a start. When the last argument wound down, and the captains dispersed with grudges half sated, Kara gathered up her notes, tucked them into a small satchel at her side. Arg caught her eye, a silent question. She gave him the smallest nod toward the corridor, and together they stepped out into quieter halls. The relief of leaving the chamber behind washed over him. Out here, the hum of pipes and the groan of metal felt cleaner than the clash of voices. "You kept them from tearing each other apart again," Arg said. His voice was low, rough from hours of listening to disputes. Kara exhaled, a small, tired laugh beneath her breath. "Barely. They'll find new reasons tomorrow." "Always do." They walked in silence for a time, weaving past crews carrying tools, voices echoing through junctions, the life of the hub pressing around them. Arg had never thought of himself as belonging anywhere, but lately the hub had become less of a stopgap and more of a center, a place to return to. Kara slowed her pace, her fingers brushing lightly against the walls as if steadying herself. Arg noticed, his brow furrowing. "You're tired." "I'm fine," she said quickly. Then, after a pause, she shook her head. "No, not fine. Just, there's something I need to tell you." He stopped with her, turning to face her fully. The corridor was quiet here, just the distant hum of ducks above them. Her eyes held steady on his, calm but carrying something deeper. "I'm pregnant," Kara said. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the hub's walls, heavier than anything Arg had ever carried. For a heartbeat, the station noise faded into silence. He stared at her, trying to make the words real, to fit them into the shape of his world. She rested a hand lightly on her abdomen, the smallest gesture, but it drove the truth into him with force. 2 months, she said softly. The medtech's confirmed. Arg felt his chest tighten, his thoughts stuttering. He had known battles, and faced choices that cut deep into survival. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. A child. Their child. His voice, when it came, was rough, stripped bare. Ours? Kara nodded, and for the first time that day, her composure faltered just enough to show the fear beneath it. Arg reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She pressed her forehead against his chest, and he held her as though letting go might break something fragile. We'll do better than what we had, he said. It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a vow pulled from the raw edge of his being. Kara's reply was a small, steady nod against him. It was enough. The days after shifted subtly, though the hub moved on with its usual chaos. Kara handled her duties with the same careful patience, but Arg noticed the difference. She sat more often during meetings, measured her words instead of pushing her energy too far. Her steps were slower at the end of long days, though she had said little of it. Arg carried the knowledge differently. It colored every glance at the station walls, every tally of supplies, every noise of machinery. He had always been cautious. Survival demanded it. But now he was relentless. He checked everything twice. Every route, every system, every repair. Mistakes weren't just dangerous anymore. They were unthinkable. He was in the middle of one of those checks, bent over a diagnostics panel near the widow's berth, when the message came through. A sharp tone from the comm unit cut through the quiet hum of systems. Arg straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and keyed the receiver. The station commander's face appeared, worn with lines carved deep by years of strain. Eyes sharp as ever. He didn't waste words. Arg, the commander said. His voice carried that clipped edge of authority. Not a request, but not yet an order. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow morning in my office. The connection cut just before Arg could respond. Just a summons, nothing more. Arg stood there for a moment, staring at the blank screen. He could feel the weight of it pressing down. The commander didn't call without cause. Behind him, the widow sat in her berth, silent and waiting. Above, the hub's walls groaned faintly, carrying the sound of 1,000 lives pressed close together. Arg drew a long breath, letting it fill him, steady him. Whatever the commander wanted, it would change things. And now, with Kara's secret carried between them, every change carried more weight than ever before. Chapter 1. The Weight of Two Futures. The hub's central ring never truly quieted, though by station time it was early enough that half the crew still staggered from their bunks with the sour looks of people not ready for another day. The faint, ever-present tang of recycled air clung to the metal walls, pipes rattling somewhere out of sight, carrying the lifeblood of the station in thin streams of oxygen and water. For all its vastness, the hub felt close, shoulders brushing in corridors, voices colliding into a din that left no room for silence. Arg cut through the noise like a blade, broad-shouldered, heavy-booted, face set into its usual unyielding scowl. He moved with the kind of presence that forced others aside without needing to speak. Some nodded, respectful, acknowledging his part in holding the fragile guild together. Others avoided his gaze, wary, remembering that the same man had once been little more than a ghostly threat from the widow, a figure whispered about more than seen. He hadn't slept much. Kara had drifted into rest beside him hours before, her breathing steady, her body curling protectively around the small secret she carried. He had stayed awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling of their cramped berth aboard the widow, every groan of the station's metal feeding the churn in his chest. The commander's summons had hung in his mind all night, its weight pressing harder each time he thought of Kara's hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. Now he climbed the steps towards the commander's office, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. The guards outside barely looked at him before waving him through. The summons carried its own authority. Inside, the commander's office was more a bunker than a workspace. Steel walls lined with maps, both printed and hand-sketched, some so old the edges curled. Screens hummed with endless streams of data, supply tallies, guild agreements, requests for arbitration. A battered mug of cough sat at the edge of the desk, cold enough that the smell of stale grounds clung to the air. The commander himself sat behind the desk, hands folded, eyes sharp. Years had cut deep lines into his face, but nothing dulled the intensity in his stare. Sit. Arg remained standing, folding his arms across his chest. The commander didn't press the matter. He leaned back instead, his chair creaking. Something stirring at the belt's edge. A derelict station, dead since the war. But it's not as dead as it should be. We've caught heat signatures, power fluctuations. Enough to say someone, or something, is moving inside it. Arg's brows knit together. Squatters? Could be, or something worse. Either way, I can't ignore it, and I can't spare half-trained scav crews to go poking around. The commander's gaze narrowed. You've got the widow. You've got the scars that tell me you know what's waiting out there. You'll take her out, you'll see what's moving in that corpse of a station, and you'll report back. Simple. Arg's silence stretched long enough for the hum of the machinery in the walls to fill the space. He knew the commander well enough to hear the layers beneath his clipped words. It wasn't just a request. It wasn't even really an order. It was a necessity, carved sharp and unavoidable. But Arg's thoughts weren't on the derelict. They were on Kara. On the quiet way she had told him, her voice steady, though her hand trembled ever so slightly. I'm pregnant. 2 months. The words still rattled inside him, echoing. A truth he could barely hold. A truth that reshaped every part of him, whether he wanted it or not. The commander misread the silence as hesitation of another kind. His voice hardened. Don't mistake this for choice. You know what happens if we leave questions unanswered out there. The hub survives because we look into the shadows before they swallow us whole. You want the guild to mean something? Then this is part of it. Arg's eyes lifted towards the map pinned to the walls. Dots and crosses marking stations lost to collapse, to raiders, to silence. He had walked in too many derelicts already, listened to the way air groaned in halls not meant to be alive, seen the bodies left behind by mistakes. He knew the ghosts waiting in such places. Finally, his voice came low, rough. And if I refuse? The commander leaned forward, elbows on his desk, eyes sharp as wire. Then the guild loses more than it gains, and the hub loses the only man I trust not to come back in a body bag. You think you're carrying too much? Then carry this too. We don't have anyone else. For the first time, the commander's tone dipped, not softer, but lower, almost wary. You've lived in the dark more than anyone. That's why it has to be you. When Arg stepped back into the corridors, the noise of the hub pressed in again. Dock crews shouting across gantries, welders throwing sparks into stale air, the distant clatter of machinery grinding against its limits. He moved through it on instinct, his body still caught in the tension of the commander's words. Kara was waiting near the docks, her figure reflected faintly against the viewport that looked out into the stars. She had wrapped her jacket tight around her, but Arg couldn't stop saying what he knew now. Couldn't stop thinking of the small pulse of life hidden beneath. Well? She asked. Arg's throat worked before the words came. He wants me on the widow. I'll pass the hub. Derelict station. Supposed to be dead, but isn't. He says it's not a request. Kara's face didn't change, but her jaw set tighter. Of course. They walked side by side, the clamor of the docks washing over them, ships creaking in their berths, loaders shouted, the smell of burnt fuel mixed with sour tang of human bodies pressed too close. Yet between them, Silence held heavier than the din. Finally, Kara broke it. Then we need to think practical. Arg turned his head towards her, brows furrowed. You can't take me with you, she said simply. The words landed like a blow he had been bracing for. The widow had been their shared space, their fragile shelter against the chaos. Now she was telling him what he already knew. That shelter had to break. You'll stay here, he said, though his voice cracked on the edges. Kara nodded. I'll move near the med wing. Quarters are small, but it'll keep me close to what I need, and close enough to the guild to keep things from unraveling while you're gone. Arg clenched his fist at his sides. The thought of leaving her in these narrow halls, without the hum of the widow around her, twisted something in him. It's not the same. No, Kara said, her voice quieter now. It's not. They had stopped near the widow's berth, her black hull looming above them, scarred but strong. Arg stared at her, the ship that had carried them through too much already, the ship that had seemed more honest than any chamber full of arguing captains. His chest felt like it was being pulled apart, one half toward the duty the commander had set, the other toward the fragile new future Kara carried. Kara's hands found his forearm, her touch grounding. You promised me once you'd always come back. Her voice was soft, steady, but underneath it, he could hear the plea. Keep that promise. He covered her hand with his own, his rough palm swallowing hers. I will. Above them, the hub groaned under its own weight, the sound of metal straining as if to remind them that nothing here was ever certain. Arg let the sound sink in, let it bind himself to the vow he had just spoken. Kara watched Arg long after her words settled into silence. He stood like stone, every line of his body carrying weight he wouldn't share aloud. She had learned to read the tension in him in their short months together, though she doubted anyone else could see it. Inside, her own turmoil ran deeper than she let him see. She had told him the truth because she couldn't hold it alone. But that didn't mean she had untangled what it meant. A child. Their child. In the middle of scarcity, of uncertainty, of a life lived on steel and recyc. She should have been afraid, and she was. But the fear was braided with something stubborn. Something almost like hope. She placed her hand against her stomach, hidden beneath her jacket. 2 months, the med techs had said. Too early to show, but early enough that her body felt the changes. She had mediated disputes with captains twice her size without blinking, but the thought of her body reshaping itself for another life made her feel small, vulnerable. Arg's vow, I will, echoed in her, but she knew too well what the belt would take from its people. Promises bent easily in the void. Still, when she looked at him, she believed him, at least enough to let him go when the time came. And that was the weight she carried now, the future of the hub in one direction, the fragile spark of a child in the other, both tied to Arg as if he were the hinge on which the belt itself would turn. In Chapter 2, Preparations and Farewell. The widow sat hunched in her berth like some great beast at rest, her blackened hull scarred and pitted from years of service. Dockhands moved around her with the grudging respect of people who knew better than to treat her like any other scavenger ship. She had carried more weight than most stations, more stories than a single crew could name. Arg stood at the edge of the berth, arms folded, eyes dragging over every seam, every patch, every faint scar that marked her survival. He had walked her decks for years, but this time the sight twisted in him differently. It wasn't the widow he doubted. It was himself. The commander's words hadn't left his ears since the meeting. The derelict station, not dead enough to stay forgotten. Activities no one could account for. And Arg, always Arg, was the one sent to look into the dark. He strode up the ramp, boots ringing hollow on steel. Inside, the widow smelled of oil, metal, and faint ozone, a blend he had once called home. He ran his hand along the wall as if the ship itself could give him answers. "Supplies first," he muttered. He spent the next hours in motion, hauling sealed crates of ration packs into the widow, securing them onto cargo clamps with more care than most captains spared. Water drums followed, heavy and awkward, sweating condensation on the stale dock air. He checked seals twice, 3 times. Out there, a bad seal was the same as a death sentence. From supplies, he moved to tools. EVA suits, patched but functional. Tethers, spare tanks, repair kits, welding rigs, a small arsenal of cutting torches, because in the void, cutting through a hatch could matter as much as firing a weapon. He calibrated sensors himself, hunched over panels until the readouts glowed steady. Each adjustment tightened the knot inside him instead of loosening it. When he found himself staring at the empty crew quarters, silence pressed down like a weight. He closed the door and didn't look again. This time, the widow would not carry Kara. That absence felt louder than everything else. While Arg buried himself in preparations, Kara walked the hub's inner ring with a single satchel slung across her shoulder. She had already sent word through guild channels. She would be relocating nearer to the medwing. Whispers followed her down the corridor. Not sharp enough to cut, but enough that she could feel the eyes at her back. Her new quarters were little more than a cubicle tucked into the wall. One narrow bunk, a locker, a thin partition that hummed faintly with the vibration of pipes behind it. She stepped inside, setting the satchel down on the bunk, her hand brushing the wall like she might feel something steady there. It wasn't the widow. The air here lacked the faintest pulse of a ship alive under her feet. Here, the air smelled recycled a dozen times over, tinged with the sharp antiseptic drifting from the medwing. But it was necessary, she told herself that over and over. She began arranging the space methodically, data pads stacked neatly on the shelf, clothes folded into the locker, a small strip of cloth, worn, soft, laid across the bunk's edge, a keepsake from her days on the Viero. Before everything had changed, practicality came first, but she let herself linger on that cloth longer than she intended. Guild aides came and went, some offering polite words, others carrying updates. Kara answered each with the same calm steadiness. But inside, every time she glanced towards the hatch, she wondered how long until Arg came to say goodbye. The widow's systems hummed low as Arg finished his last checks. He stood in the cockpit, fingers brushing over the controls, listening to the way the ship came alive under his touch. He hated the thought of leaving Kara to the hub's cramped halls. Hated it more than the derelict station waiting out there. But duty had its own weight, and he had carried it too long to set it down. When Kara finally stepped into the cockpit, Arg's shoulders stiffened before he turned. "You've been at this all day," she said quietly, her eyes sweeping over the panels, the stacked crates visible through the hatch behind him. "Needed to be sure," he replied. His voice sounded rough even to himself. Kara stepped closer. Her hand brushed one of the panels as if she were saying her own goodbye to the ship. "She'll carry you through it. She always has." Arg looked at her then, really looked. The set of her jaw, the way her jacket hung looser than before, the faint lines of strain beneath her eyes. He thought of the life she carried, unseen but undeniable. "I don't like leaving you here," he admitted. Kara met his gaze, steady. "I don't like it either, but this is how it has to be. The guild needs you on the widow, the hub needs me here, and—" her hand drifted unconsciously towards her stomach. "This needs me here too." Silence stretched between them, heavy, until Arg reached out and covered her hand with his His calloused fingers dwarfed hers, but the contact steadied them both. "I'll come back," he said. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight like iron. Kara's lips curved into something caught between a smile and a grimace. "You'd better. I'm not raising this kid to think his father was a ghost." The corner of Arg's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. They stood together for a long moment, the hum of the widow filling the silence, until Kara finally pulled back. "Go before I tell you to stay, and don't make me regret letting you walk out that hatch." Arg nodded once, heavy and sure, then turned back to the controls. He didn't watch her leave. The weight in his chest was too much. But he listened until her footsteps faded from the corridor. Only then did he let his hand rest against the console, whispering low enough the ship alone could hear. "Let's bring me home." Kara walked the narrow corridors back toward the med wing, her footsteps echoing faintly in the steel passageway. Around her, the hub carried on, crews shouting, welders sparking, air recyclers groaning, but all of it felt distant. She pressed her hand against her stomach, eyes down, her breath steady. This was the first true separation since they had chosen each other. A year together at most of it fractured by the seed trial, and now, with life growing inside her, they were once again on separate paths. But she would not break. Not for Arg, not for the guild, and not for the child who had already begun reshaping everything. She lifted her chin, shoulders squaring. The med wing loomed ahead, its pale lights spilling across the corridor. Behind her, the widow prepared for departure. The future pressed in from both directions, and she walked the thin line between them. Chapter 3. Approaching the Unknown. The widow's hull groaned as the clamps released. Arg sat strapped into the pilot's chair, hands resting heavy on the controls, eyes fixed on the viewport. Behind the glass stretched the belt. Endless black scattered with the cold fire of stars and the faint glimmer of rocks drifting in slow, silent arcs. The hub shrank behind him, its patched ring lit unevenly by scattered flood lamps. It looked less like the seat of a belt survival and more like a wound stitched together too roughly, always threatening to tear. Arg didn't let himself stare long. He couldn't. The thought of Kara still inside those walls, tucked into her narrow new quarters with the weight of their child hidden beneath her jacket, burned sharper than he wanted to admit. He pulled his focus forward. The widow surged into open space with a low, thrumming growl that vibrated through his bones. She was alive again, and now she was his alone to guide. The first hours were mechanical. Systems checks, course adjustments, engine readouts. Arg moved through them like ritual, every switch and toggle part of a dance he had known so long it seemed written into him. But when the hub fell fully into the distance, and only the belt surrounded him, the silence pressed in. He leaned back in the pilot's chair, staring at the drifting expanse. Fragments of old stations floated here and there, silent hulks that once carried life, but now spun like forgotten bones. Arg had been inside too many of them, prying loose scrap to trade, carrying bodies out when no one else would. The commander's words returned, not dead enough to stay forgotten. Arg muttered to himself, his voice rough in the empty cockpit. Always the same. Something dead that refuses to stay that way. The silence swallowed his words, leaving only the steady hum of the widow's systems. For a moment, Arg let his eyes close. He hadn't wanted to carry the memory, but it came anyway. The seed. The fractured alien thing that had twisted their path and tested them until they bled. Kara had carried its weight more directly than he had, but Arg had lived under its shadow all the same. The thought of it stirred unease. Even now, the seed and the fragments rested in containment back on the hub. He hadn't gone near them since. But when the commander spoke of a station walking after being dead, Arg couldn't help but think of the seed. How it had thrummed with a life that wasn't life. How it had pulled them all into its trial, whether they wished it or not. He opened his eyes, forcing the thought down. This will be different. It has to be. Back at the hub, Kara sat cross-legged on the bunk in her new quarters. A data slate bounced across her knees. Guild reports scrolled past. Resources tallied. Disputes among captains. Requests for mediation. She forced herself to read each line, to stay sharp, to remind herself that her role here mattered. But her mind wandered, always back to the widow, slipping into the void, always back to Arg, alone at her controls. She rested a hand on her stomach. It was still too early to feel anything, but the gesture had become habit already, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she felt. "This is how it has to be," she whispered into the empty room. The hum of pipes behind her answered in place of silence. 3 days out, the widow's sensors caught the first trace. Arg leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the faint flicker across the screen. A pulse of power, thin and erratic, like the last spark in a dying fire. "There you are," he muttered. He adjusted course, engines growling low, the widow slipping deeper into the shadows of the belt. The derelict appeared first as a silhouette against the stars, a jagged outline broken and scarred. As he closed, the details sharpened. A station ring fractured in half, one side collapsed inward, skeletal beams exposed. Panels hung loose, tethered by nothing but twisted struts. Yet in the cracks of its corpse, faint lights blinked, not steady, not strong, but alive. Arg's jaw tightened. The commander hadn't lied. Something moved here. He let the widow drift closer, thrusters firing in slow bursts. His hand hovered over the comm switch, then fell away. No signal yet, not until he knew more. Instead, he studied the broken station. His mind catalogued the scars, burn marks from weapons fire, gaps from explosive decompression, makeshift plating slapped across old wounds. Someone had tried to keep this place breathing. Someone had failed. Or maybe not entirely. Arg felt the weight of the void pressing harder. "This isn't just ghosts," he whispered. The widow's sensors pulsed again, picking up faint traces of oxygen venting, heat pockets clinging like embers. There was life here, against all odds. And it was waiting. That same night, Kara jolted awake in her quarters. No dream clung to her, just the sharp certainty that Arg was near danger. She sat up, heart pounding, hand pressed against her stomach. The Medwing's low lights glowed faintly through the crack under her hatch. Beyond, the hub stirred with its usual sounds, machinery groaning, water rushing through pipes. But to Kara, it all felt distant, muffled, like she had been cut off from something vital. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing slow until the hammer of her chest eased. She told herself it was nothing but nerves, that Arg was days away in the void, too far for her to feel anything real. But the feeling lingered, all the same. Arg sat in the widow's cockpit, eyes fixed on the fractured ring of the derelict. His hand rested heavy on the controls, but he didn't move yet. The hub was far behind him. Kara was far behind him. Ahead stretched only shadow and the faint flickering promise that something had survived where nothing should have. The void hummed, waiting. Ark's jaw set hard. "Let's see who's hiding in the dark." The widow surged forward, closing the last distance into the unknown. Chapter 4. First Impressions. The widow hovered at the edge of the derelict station like a predator circling wounded prey. Its blackened hull gleamed faintly in the reflection of the distant belt stars, scarred from countless missions, welded and patched where survival demanded. Arg watched from the cockpit as the station's outline took shape. Half its ring collapsed, beams jutting outward like broken ribs, panels hanging loose, a skeleton carved against the void. Faint lights flickered within the wreckage, irregular, unstable, but unmistakably alive. Arg felt the weight of the silence around him. The void outside the viewport pressed with cold insistence, a reminder that once he stepped off the widow, nothing would protect him but his own skill and caution. He flexed his fingers over the controls, feeling the low hum of the ship beneath him, its systems alive and waiting. This was a place that should have stayed dead. Yet here it was, clinging to life. Its heartbeat irregular, but persistent. He suited up with deliberate care, each strap and seal double-checked. He clipped his tether to the airlock and stepped into the void, boots magnetized, tether lines unspooling behind him in steady clicks. The blackness of space embraced him, and he moved like a shadow along the fractured hull, eyes scanning every scar, every twisted beam, every welded patch that hinted at someone's desperate effort to hold the station together. The scars told stories, burn marks from weapons fire, jagged ruptures from explosive decompression, makeshift plates slapped crookedly over holes, rewired panels clinking to life through stripped and twisted cables. Someone had fought to keep this place breathing, and the effort had been deliberate. Even if the results were imperfect, the faintest trace of oxygen leaked from vents. Heat pockets clung stubbornly in small clusters, and Arg's sensors picked up subtle motion beyond the reach of the machines alone. He froze for a moment, the realization cutting through the mechanical rhythm of his mind. This station was not dead, and its inhabitants were human. Inside the airlock, he moved slow, methodical. Each step was measured, each motion deliberate. He remembered every lesson he learned in the derelicts before, every caution drilled into him by years of hard experience. He did not rush. He did not reach. The shadows were patient hunters, and patience would keep him alive. As his boots touched the interior deck, the air pressed against him faintly, stale and sour, carrying the tang of rust and long-abandoned machinery. The corridor stretched before him, light flickering in weak, uneven bursts from failing panels. The walls were scarred with signs of desperation, holes, scorch marks, graffiti carved by hand with nothing else to mark their existence. Some marks were warnings, crude and harsh. Others claimed territory. Some were nonsensical, born of fear and isolation. Arg took a careful step forward, letting his torch sweep the corridor in arcs that revealed glimpses of the living structure. He noticed small signs, a boot left overturned against a wall, smudged fingerprints on metal, a makeshift patch covering a gaping hole in a bulkhead. Those fragments spoke of habitation, of persistence. Someone had survived here against the odds that should have crushed them long ago. Back at the hub, Kara moved through her new quarters with mechanical precision. She stacked data pads, organized supplies, and confirmed the daily reports of guild activity, but her mind refused to settle entirely. She imagined Arg in the void, threading his way along twisting metal, aware that at any misstep the space around him could become lethal. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, feeling for the subtle signs that were not yet visible, but were there all the same. 2 months, and the reality of their child pressed heavier on her than any ration tally or guild dispute. She breathed deep and reminded herself of the discipline required, that she could not falter while he faced the unknown. Back on the derelict, Arg's senses sharpened. He paused beside a half-buried hatch, its panel rewired in crude fashion, stripped wires twisted into junctions that held just enough power to breathe life into the door. He pressed his gloved hand against the panel, watching the faint lights flicker, then stabilize. With a mechanical groan, the hatch eased open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. The air inside was stagnant, but breathable, filtered faintly through his suit, carrying the musk of rust, mildew, and decay. The station's interior breathed on its own terms, and Arg stepped inside, letting his boots echo against the deck. As he moved further, the whisper of movement reached his ears. A faint scrape of metal, tiny, uneven footsteps, a shadow that shifted against the failing light. He froze, instinct sharpening every sense. These were not machines, not ghosts. Something human lingered here, something alive and wary. The sound of their breath, quiet, deliberate, carried with it a rhythm of fear and survival. Arg's heart beat steadily, though the tension pulled tight across his chest. He lowered the torch slightly, letting the shadows stretch and dance across the corridor walls. There was no hurry, not yet. Observation first, understanding second. Only then could he decide what steps to take next. He cataloged every detail, every sound, every flicker of light that betrayed the presence of others. He did not yet glimpse faces, but the rhythm of survival was unmistakable. The patter of small feet, the scraping of metal as if someone moved constantly, never still, always alert. Kara sat quietly back at the hub, listening to the faint hum of her quarters and the medwing beyond. She could not hear the station, could not know the rhythm of life Arg was feeling in the void. Yet she sensed the danger, a physical ache pressing at her chest. She held her hand to her stomach and breathed, steadying herself against the pulse of worry. He had faced these odds before, and he would survive. But the thought of him threading the corridors of a dying station alone made her pulse quicken in spite of herself. She focused instead on guild matters, keeping the hub grounded, keeping herself functional. Survival demanded it, and for now, it was all she could do. Arg moved deeper into the derelict, every corridor presenting new challenges. Broken walls, uneven floors, exposed cabling snaking along the ceiling like veins, bulkheads that buckled under the stress of time. Every step required calculation, every movement weighed against unseen threats. The faint light revealed evidence of habitation, scraps of food stored under panels, crude bedding, marks where someone had clearly tried to secure a small corner of the station against the void. Whoever lived here had learned to survive on minimal resources, to adapt to the uncertainty of a failing station. He paused to listen. Small sounds, barely perceptible, echoed in the corridor. A whisper, a shuffle, the clink of metal as someone shifted. His torch traced the corridor walls, catching on twisted pipes, broken panels, and scrawled messages. Warnings, names, crude claims of ownership. Arg felt a chill, a recognition that these were not ordinary survivors. These were people hardened by necessity, desperate and wary, living on the edge of everything the belt had ever offered. The first contact would be delicate. The wrong move, the wrong tone, and everything could collapse into hostility. He'd seen it before. Ghosts turn aggressive. Scavengers turned violent. Children turned cruel in desperation. Patience, observation, timing. The fundamentals of survival in the void were still intact, and he intended to respect them. He advanced further, letting the corridor guide him. The flickering lights traced the shadows, revealing small details: a shoe left in haste, fingerprints on metal, a crude barricade reinforced a doorway. Each detail hinted at human life, careful and wary. Whoever they had been hiding, observing, and surviving for longer than Arg had expected. At the hub, Kara leaned against the walls, eyes closed, focusing on her breathing. She imagined him moving through the dark, careful, precise. She felt the first real pang of separation, a tangible ache of distance, worry, and hope braided together. She reminded herself of discipline, of patience, of her own role in keeping the hub stable while he faced the unknown. Back in the station, Arg paused in the widening corridor, taking stock. The life here was fragile, unpredictable, but undeniable. He let his torch illuminate the space, scanning for movement, for shadows that betrayed presence, for any clue that could help him understand the inhabitants before direct contact. The derelict whispered its secrets in the hum of failing systems, the creak of metal, the faint pulse of life that persisted against impossible odds. Arg inhaled slowly through his suit, letting the rhythm settle in his chest. He would meet this place on its own terms. He would see who lived here, learn their patterns, understand their survival before stepping further. And then, when he was ready, he would make his presence known. The station waited, patient and wary. The void waited, cold and absolute. Arg pressed forward, boots echoing on the fractured deck, heart steady, eyes sharp. The first living traces of the derelict were human, and Arg knew the meeting ahead would define what happened next. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. Chapter 5. Hostile Welcome. Arg moved deeper into the derelict, each step deliberate, boots echoing faintly against the deck as the corridor twisted and narrowed. Faint lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced across scorched walls. The smell of rust and stale air clung to every surface, heavy and oppressive. His sensors whispered that someone, or something, was ahead. The faint heat signatures, subtle fluctuations of oxygen, the near imperceptible motion, all signs pointed to life, but not enough to draw confidence. He rounded a corner slowly, tetherline taut behind him, and froze. Shadows shifted faster than he expected, small figures, thin, ragged, and wary, sprang from behind bulkheads and low partitions. They carried nothing more than improvised tools, bits of scrap fashioned into crude weapons, metal rods, twisted pipes, shards of broken paneling. Their eyes were sharp, dark with suspicion, their postures defensive, ready to strike. Arg raised his hand slowly, torch angled to illuminate himself without aggression. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, voice calm but firm. "I just want to understand what's going on here." A boy, no older than 13, stepped forward, torch in hand like a spear. "Get out," he spat, voice brittle with fear. "This is ours. We don't need you." Another figure, smaller, maybe 10, hissed from the shadows, backing the first. "Leave now or we'll make you." Ark's jaw clenched. He had expected wariness, maybe resistance, but not immediate aggression. Still, the fundamentals hadn't changed. Patience first, observe second, intervention only when necessary. He lowered his torch a little, letting the light wash over the ragged figures, showing them his empty hands. "I can't leave just yet," he said evenly. "I need to know who's alive in here. I need to understand how you survive." The oldest among them, a girl with a harsh scar across her cheek, stepped forward, eyes narrowing, Survive? You mean scavenge, steal, and watch everyone else die? We survive because we have to. Now go, or we'll make you. Arg didn't flinch. He kept his movements deliberate. I've lived in places like this, he said, letting the words carry weight. I know hunger, fear, and desperation. I am not your enemy. A tense pause followed. The children's eyes flickered amongst themselves, doubt mingling with defiance. Their improvised weapons wavered but didn't drop. The older girl shifted, eyeing him with careful calculation of someone who had learned every trick necessary to survive. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deep in the corridor. A warning, or perhaps a test. The smallest boy shrank back while the girl's gaze sharpened. Ark took the opportunity to take a careful step closer. Careful. Measured. I can help you, he said. Not with the threats, not with fights, with repairs, with tools, with food if you need it. But I can't help if you force me out. They whispered amongst themselves, low voices carrying fear, doubt, and curiosity. Ark held his position, allowing them to decide, showing no sign of weakness, but none of aggression either. A faint movement behind a crate caught his eye. A girl, younger than the others, peered at him, face pale but intrigued. She didn't speak, didn't step forward, but her presence was enough to hint that not all of them shared the same hard-edged hostility. Arg's mind cataloged the small signals, hesitation, micro-expressions of doubt, the way their fingers gripped weapons, each one a story, each one a key to survival. He had dealt with resistances before, but this was different. These were children hardened into fighters by necessity, carrying trauma in every scowl, every wary glance, every tense stance. Minutes stretched, the corridor holding its breath with them. Ark didn't break the silence first. He let them. Let them choose their pace, their trust, their fear. He studied the older girl, noting her protective stance, the way she kept the younger ones behind her, the tension in her shoulders. Leadership born of necessity. They had learned quickly that life demanded strength, even from children. Then the girl spoke again, her voice lower this time, threading caution with authority. Why should we believe you? Everyone else tried, everyone else, she broke off, eyes narrowing. What do you want? Arg met her gaze unsteadily. I want to understand, he said. I want to help you survive the way you've helped others. You don't have to trust me now. You only need to know that you're alive and that you want to keep going. A subtle shift occurred. Weapons didn't drop, but their grips loosened, if only slightly. Their whispers grew softer, their stances less rigid. One of the older boys exhaled sharply, almost imperceptibly, his eyes flickering to the smallest figures behind the girl. Survival meant calculation, and every instinct they had told them he wasn't the immediate threat. Arg continued to move slowly, methodical, each step measured to maintain trust, to avoid triggering panic. He sat down a small ration pack on the desk, visible, unthreatening, then stepped back. A quiet invitation, no more, no less. The older girl stared at it, fingers twitching, torn between suspicion and necessity. Hunger and practicality would always edge curiosity. Finally, she glanced at the others, nodded subtly, then stepped forward just enough to inspect the pack. The motion was careful, deliberate, testing his intentions without fully committing. Arg remained still, torch angled low, body relaxed but aware. Minutes passed as the tension eased slightly, trust forming in whispers, glances, small gestures. He cataloged everything, noting names in his head, relationships, hierarchies, the fragile balance of power and dependence. By the time the sun of the belt would have created the horizon in distant systems, Arg had managed to establish the first tentative understanding. He hadn't known their trust entirely, but he had survived the first hostile encounter. And more importantly, he had observed, cataloged, and begun to understand the dynamics of life within the derelict. Back at the hub, Kara pressed her hand against her stomach again, feeling the faint rhythm that reminded her of the life she carried. She imagined Arg threading the corridors, standing among children shaped by desperation and laws, keeping them alive, while keeping himself steady. She allowed herself the faintest breath of relief when she pictured him uninjured, torch casting a long shadow, moving deliberately. The guild's work could wait. This was their real challenge, the one that pressed closer than any dispute over rations or authority. Arg stayed low in the corridor, observing the ragged group as they assessed him, their movements careful, defensive, cautious. The night stretched around him, the station alive with flickering lights and whispering motions. Each small gesture told a story, each subtle glance a warning, and each hesitant step forward toward a measure of progress. He would need patience, strategy, and restraint. They were children, but they were survivors, and he was alone. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavy on his shoulders. They would test him. They would challenge him. They would force him to prove that he was more than just an intruder, and he would have to be ready, for the smallest misstep could cost more than just his own life in this place. Arg adjusted his tether, torch low, sensors scanning, taking in every shadow, every flicker, every heartbeat that betrayed movement. The derelict was alive, dangerous, and waiting. He was now a part of its story, whether it wanted him or not. And he would remain, learning their rhythms, observing their strengths, cataloging their weaknesses until he understood how to guide them, protect them, and if possible, earn their trust. The children watched him, wary and alert, every muscle coiled, yet some hint of curiosity flickering beneath the armor of survival. This was the first test, and he had passed only in patience and observation. The next would demand more. Arg's hands brushed a panel along the corridor, grounding himself to the fragile metal of the station, feeling its faint vibration, the echo of human life inside. He had entered their world. Now he had to prove that he belonged to it. The derelict held its breath. He did the same. The end of Part 1 of Void Miner, Children of the Belt.